What we are about to show you would have been unthinkable a generation ago. These shouting matches at Senate hearings were never the norm in previous administrations. Today, Senator Brian Schatz pressed Secretary Rubio on chip sales to China, the 6 assurances on Taiwan, and the closed Strait of Hormuz. Rubio defended the China trip and said Iran is weaker than ever. Watch the exchange. Our research team will break it down at the end.
Being here. Tomorrow I'm going to have you in the Appropriations Committee, and we'll walk the list that we talked about a couple of weeks ago on a conference call, so I won't cover that. I want you to sort of answer the China watchers who saw that visit to China and saw that NVIDIA is now going to sell H200s. I understand that's not our highest technology, but it's better than what China has, and that's why people are worried. And that, I mean, it's pretty plain that the president violated one of the 6 assurances. I understand that the ambassador and you and others have sort of followed up to kind of smooth the edges, but I mean, it's pretty clear. He says, we discussed arms sales in great detail. It depends on China. It's a very good negotiating chip for us. So what do you say to China watchers who say they got some pretty good deliverables and we didn't get much?
I don't see the trip. There were some deliverables, you know, the purchase of additional Boeing aircraft, which of course is beneficial to the Chinese as well, but helps our company, some of the agricultural concessions. But the trip was largely, for the most part, about the fact that the 2 largest, most powerful countries in the world have to have direct interaction with one another. And this was an opportunity to do it. He will reciprocate by visiting the United States later next year. Separate from that, and I don't know if you were here at the outset in my opening statement, or maybe it was in response to one of the questions, I think 2 things are clear. Number one is that we're entering into a period of strategic stability that I think serves the interest of both countries, because the last thing we want is a largely destabilizing event in the Indo Pacific. But the second is that there are clear differences of priorities. There are clear irritants in that relationship that are longstanding and that are going to be long-term. As in, critical minerals dependencies, things of this nature. So it's one of those relationships that's going to require very deft diplomacy and mature decision-making.
Sure, and this is why I like our engagement. Like, that makes sense to me, but it seems to me that if the main objective is to kind of touch gloves and initiate conversations, then why give away any of the things that they're already seeking in exchange for essentially nothing? I mean, you're basically saying it's better to talk than not to. It's better to engage than not to. It's better to be in a period of stability than not. I agree with all that. I just don't understand why we would want to sell them our second best chips, and why we would start to at least complicate the question of our assurances regarding Taiwan. I'm going to move over. We're going to stay in the Asia-Pacific region. The Marshalls, the Philippines, and Tuvalu have declared a national emergency on their energy situation. South Korea says its energy crisis is a war-like situation. You've been around a long time on this committee and now as secretary. It is always the case that something in the Middle East undermines our ability to project power in the Asia-Pacific region. But it's not just a question of opportunity cost and attentional challenges. Now we're talking about our allies in the Asia-Pacific region really taking it on the chin with energy costs because of the Strait of Hormuz. What do we say to them? Just hang in there?
Yeah, no, a couple points. It's one of the steps that we've taken and some of the things that we've done around the world, whether it's the release of strategic reserves, whether it's not popular, but, you know, we got questions about here earlier today, but making available for a limited period of time both Iranian oil on the water, though they don't enjoy the revenue of it, and some of the Russian oil on the water as well. The third point, though, that this points to is a much deeper one, and that is that while the Straits of Hormuz provides about 20% of the global oil supply, it is probably 80 or 90% of the supply in the Indo Pacific, given the geography and so forth. So one of the things that I think is going to come about as a result of all this in the long term is more diversification in where they're going to get their energy from, including from the United States, potentially, certainly with Japan and some other countries in the region will benefit.
But you know that the sort of project
it takes time.
It all takes time. So
understood.
That's like cold comfort if you're running a country and your gasoline and your fertilizer and all your input prices just skyrocketed because of President Trump's decision to go to war with a country clear across the world.
But see, I don't, and I understand your point, but I also think in all these questions, we're getting a lot of questions about us. I don't think it's fair because ultimately, the people who have closed the Straits of Hormuz are Iran, and they're doing so in violation of every international law you can imagine. The Chinese are against it. Everyone is. We have, I think, a record number, 140 co-sponsors at the United Nations on this resolution that hasn't come up for a vote yet to condemn what they're doing and to reopen the
nobody's
Straits.
defending what Iran is doing. I think what we're saying is this was not just predictable, it was predicted. This was what everybody said. You don't have to be some expert in foreign policy. You don't need to get into a skiff. You could literally put this into an LLM and say, what'll happen if we take kinetic action against Iran? And the first thing that would pop out is, well, they'll probably close the Strait of Hormuz. So it's really shocking to me the degree to which this administration expresses shock that the thing that everybody said was going to happen ended up happening.
But here's the point I would make on that, and that the reverse of that is, so that the alternative is to say, well, then we have to go ahead and let Iran develop a nuclear weapon or they'll close the Straits of Hormuz. I mean, at some point you have to take action on this situation, understanding there'll be a reaction to it, but it cannot be. Iran will always have the ability to threaten the Straits. You don't need much sophistication to, if you threaten commercial vessels and shooting them, they're going to stop moving. Dropping mines, by the way, it's not just Iran that can do it. The Houthis could do it in the Red Sea, and they're not nearly as large as Iran is. I think this is a more fundamental challenge, and that is, are we now forever limited doing it? Do we just have to let Iran go ahead and develop a nuclear weapon because of their threat to close the Straits of Hormuz? That's an untenable situation.
Secretary Rubio, thank you.
But I'll see him tomorrow, so don't worry.
Yeah, okay, that's good.
What made this exchange heated was not the volume in the room or the pace of the back and forth. The real pressure point was leverage. Senator Schatz was not asking a soft question about diplomacy. He was asking a transactional question. If the United States is the strongest country in the room, why are we giving the other side things they already want, in exchange for very little that we needed? Schatz framed the China trip, the chip decision, and the Taiwan messaging as one connected pattern. Rubio defended each piece separately, but the senator kept pulling the lens back to a single question. What did America get for what America gave? That is the frame to remember as the rest of this analysis breaks down what happened, why each line landed, and what should be measured next. Schatz opened with the NVIDIA H200 chip decision. His point was not that the H200 is the most advanced American chip. He admitted that it is not. His point was sharper. The H200 is still significantly more capable than what China currently builds at scale, and selling it shortens the gap that American policy spent years widening. That is why China watchers reacted. The argument inside the export control community has always been about distance, not about absolute capability. Every step that closes the distance is a step the rest of American policy has to compensate for elsewhere. Schatz was asking Rubio to explain what American interest justified that closing of distance. Rubio did not directly defend the chip decision. He pivoted to the broader logic of the visit. That gap in the answer is what made the moment land. Schatz then raised the 6 assurances, the long-standing American commitments to Taiwan that frame how Washington talks about arms sales, sovereignty, and the cross-strait balance. His claim was direct. He said it is pretty plain that the president violated one of those assurances, and that public reporting showed arms sales being discussed as a negotiating chip with Beijing. That is not a small accusation. The 6 assurances are part of how Taiwan reads American reliability. If arms sales become tradable in a wider deal, then every recipient of an American security guarantee in Asia and beyond has to reread what that guarantee means. Schatz was careful. He acknowledged that the ambassador and others had worked to smooth the edges, but he insisted the underlying signal had been sent and that it could not be fully recalled by later cleanup. Rubio answered by listing what the visit actually produced. He named the purchase of additional Boeing aircraft, which he framed as helpful to American manufacturing while also helpful to Chinese aviation. He cited agricultural concessions that matter to American farmers and to the Chinese consumer market. And he flagged the agreement to reciprocate with a Chinese leadership visit to the United States the following year. Those are concrete items. They are not trivial, but Schatz was asking a different question. He was not arguing that nothing came back. He was arguing that the price paid for those items was higher than what they delivered, especially when the price included a softened message on Taiwan and a relaxed posture on advanced semiconductor exports. Rubio listed the gains. Schatz challenged the value of the gains relative to the cost. Rubio then went to his preferred frame. He argued that the two largest, most powerful countries in the world must have direct interaction, and that the visit was an opportunity to establish that channel. He said the United States and China were entering a period of strategic stability, which he described as serving the interest of both sides because neither benefits from a destabilizing event in the Indo Pacific. That is the strongest version of the administration's argument. It treats engagement as the prize. It treats the alternative, escalation by miscommunication, as the unacceptable outcome. Inside that frame, even uneven deliverables can be justified because the real product is a working channel between Washington and Beijing. Schatz did not reject that frame outright. He simply said it does not explain why specific concessions were required to open that channel. Schatz's counter was concrete and quiet. He agreed that talking is better than not talking. He agreed that engaging is better than not engaging. He agreed that a period of stability is better than a period of confrontation. Then he made the move that mattered. If the main objective is just to touch gloves and start the conversation, why is the United States giving up things the other side has already been seeking, in exchange for what amounts to very little? In other words, the goal of engagement does not require trading away the second-best chip, and it does not require softening the Taiwan message. Schatz was not arguing against diplomacy. He was arguing that diplomacy was being used to justify concessions that diplomacy did not actually need. Then Schatz turned the conversation to American allies in the Pacific. He named the Marshalls, the Philippines, and Tuvalu, all of which had declared national emergencies over their energy situation. He then cited South Korea, which had described its own energy crisis as a war-like situation. That is unusually strong language from a treaty ally and a major economy. Schatz used those examples to do something specific. He moved the conversation away from abstract great power talk and into the lived experience of partner countries who were absorbing the consequences of decisions made far from their borders. His message to Rubio was simple. While Washington debates strategy with Beijing, our partners in the region are paying the bill for a different decision made about Iran. Schatz and Rubio both acknowledged the geography. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 20% of global oil supply. That number by itself sounds manageable, but the number that mattered in this exchange was different. The Indo Pacific gets somewhere between 80 and 90% of its oil through that same strait. So a disruption that is uncomfortable in Europe and the United States is something closer to an existential energy threat to allied economies in Asia. Rubio acknowledged that asymmetry and used it to argue for long-term diversification, including more American energy exports to allies like Japan. That is a real strategic answer over time. But Schatz was asking about now. About fertilizer prices, gasoline prices, and household budgets in countries that have to keep functioning while diversification is still on the drawing board. Rubio's response was procedural and patient. He pointed to the release of strategic petroleum reserves, even though that move had drawn its own criticism earlier in the hearing. He flagged decisions to make certain volumes of Iranian and Russian oil temporarily available on the water, while denying those regimes the revenue. And he sketched a longer horizon in which more diversified suppliers, including the United States, fill the gap for Asian allies. Each of those steps is real policy. None of them is automatic relief. They take months to ripple through global energy markets. They require coordination with private producers, with allied governments, and with shipping insurance markets. Schatz did not dismiss the answers. He simply said that the people most affected by this disruption do not have months to wait for a redesigned global energy map. Schatz called the long horizon answer what it actually is to allies on the receiving end. Cold comfort. If you are running a country in the Pacific right now, and your gasoline is more expensive, and your fertilizer is more expensive, and every input that touches manufacturing or food production is more expensive, the explanation that diversification will help over the next decade does not pay your bills this quarter. That is the bluntest version of the senator's broader argument. American policy choices have downstream costs that fall on partners and households. The question is not whether those costs are temporary. The question is whether they were necessary, whether they were anticipated, and whether the country that imposed them has a plan to make the affected partners whole. Rubio pushed back on that frame by redirecting blame. He said it was not entirely fair to keep questioning American policy when the actors actually closing the Strait of Hormuz are the Iranians. in violation of nearly every international maritime norm. That is a true statement. Iran is the proximate cause of the disruption. Closing a critical shipping lane is an aggressive act, no matter how it is dressed up politically, but Schatz never disputed that. His point was about sequencing. The dispute is not whether Iran is acting badly now. The dispute is whether the policy choices that led up to this moment were ones that made the Iranian response more likely. That is a different question. It is the question that political analysts and historians will spend the next several years trying to answer. Rubio also leaned on diplomatic momentum. He said the United States had assembled what he described as a record number of co-sponsors at the United Nations, around 140 countries, behind a resolution to condemn the closure and to demand that the strait be reopened. That is meaningful in narrative terms. It positions the United States as the leader of a global response, not as the architect of a global problem. The catch is that the resolution had not yet come up for a vote. So the diplomatic accomplishment was promised, not delivered. Schatz did not attack that directly, but by repeatedly asking what could be told to allies right now, he was implicitly drawing the contrast. Resolutions that have not been voted on do not lower the price of gasoline in Manila, Seoul, or any of the island nations Schatz had just named. This is where Schatz delivered the line that will travel furthest from this hearing. He said no one needed to be a foreign policy expert to predict what would happen after kinetic action against Iran. You did not need a classified briefing room. You did not need a National Security Council debate. You could literally type the scenario into a large language model and ask what would happen next. And the first answer would be that Iran would probably close the Strait of Hormuz. That is more than a one-liner. It is an argument about institutional knowledge. It says the analysts who warned about this were not making clever guesses. They were stating what was widely known, and it sharpens the senator's central point. If the response was this predictable, then declaring surprise about it now is not a defense. It is an admission. Schatz drove that point home. He said it was shocking to him how much the administration was expressing shock at exactly the consequence that almost every analyst had predicted in advance. That argument matters because it changes how Americans should read the cost of the current situation. If a policy decision had a probable, well-known downside, then the people who chose the policy effectively chose the downside as well. They cannot later treat the downside as a surprise event that requires sympathy. They have to defend the decision on its merits, including the predictable costs that are now being borne by allies and by American consumers. That is the standard Schatz was trying to install in the hearing record. Decisions should be judged together with their predicted consequences, not separately from them. Rubio's strongest answer to that pressure was the nuclear question. He framed the choice as a binary. Either the United States takes action to disrupt the path to an Iranian nuclear weapon and accepts that Iran will respond, or the United States allows Iran to keep moving toward a weapon and accepts whatever world that produces. He said the country could not adopt a posture in which Iran's ability to threaten the Strait of Hormuz becomes a permanent veto on every other tool of policy. That is a serious argument. Non-proliferation matters. The risk of a nuclear-armed regional power in the Middle East is real. And there is a legitimate question about whether refusing to act today simply moves the cost to a more dangerous tomorrow. Rubio wanted that question framed as the real question. Schatz did not concede that framing. Where this debate became hard to follow is that two distinct questions kept getting blurred together. The first question is whether the United States should act to prevent an Iranian nuclear weapon. The second question is whether the specific action that was taken, at the specific time it was taken, was the best available option, given what was known about the likely Iranian response. You can answer yes to the first question and still raise serious concerns about the second. Schatz was largely working on the second question. Rubio was largely answering with the first. That is why the exchange felt unresolved. Both sides were correct about different things. But the public conversation will only become productive if those two questions are kept apart, so that each one can be argued, judged, and tested on its own evidence. Rubio added a second point that deserves attention. He noted that Iran is not the only actor capable of threatening a major waterway. The Houthis demonstrated as much in the Red Sea, and they are far smaller and far less capitalized than Iran. That is true, and it has policy implications. It means the United States cannot treat any single regime as the only chokepoint risk. The map is full of chokepoints. The world is full of armed groups willing to use them. So the long-term answer is not just deterring one country. It is reducing the fragility of global supply lines as a whole. That conclusion actually aligns with Schatz's earlier point. Both senators agree that dependence on choke points is dangerous. They disagree on whether the current administration is reducing or increasing that dependence in practice. Strip away the rhetoric and ask what allies actually hear. They hear that Washington understands their pain but cannot solve it on their timetable. They hear that long-term diversification is coming. They hear that there is a coalition forming at the United Nations. And they hear that the underlying confrontation, which is driving their bills upward right now, is being judged as necessary because of a broader nuclear concern they were not part of weighing. Schatz wanted the hearing record to capture that, because how a policy lands among partners is itself a strategic outcome. If allies absorb costs without any voice in the decision, the next request for cooperation gets harder. Trust is a currency in alliances. Spending it without replacing it is not free, even if no one issues a bill in the moment. The most useful follow-up to this exchange is not which senator sounded sharper. It is what the documents show. The internal memoranda around the H200 export decision. The negotiating notes from the China trip about Boeing volumes, agricultural commitments, and the precise language used about Taiwan. The decision memos that preceded the action against Iran, including the predicted scenarios about the Strait of Hormuz. And the diplomatic readouts that show what allies were told before the decision, not after. Those records exist. They are the only fair way to test the rival framings offered in this hearing. Talking points are political. Decision memos are accountable. Schatz was trying to set a marker that those documents should be on the table when the committee reviews the policy. That is what serious oversight looks like. So the final accountability question is the one Schatz pushed throughout. What did the policy gain, what did it cost, and who is paying that cost? If the gain is a safer world, with the path to an Iranian nuclear weapon meaningfully blocked, with Beijing engaged in a stable channel that prevents a worse crisis, and with American manufacturing and agriculture better positioned over time, then the administration has a serious case to make. If the cost is a softened message on Taiwan that allies will read for years, a chip decision that closes the gap with a strategic rival, a Pacific energy shock that allies absorb while Washington explains, and a string of predicted consequences treated as surprises, then the case becomes much harder. The committee should make both sides put their numbers on the table. Then the public can decide what kind of policy it is actually buying.